well, this talks just about what you see there on the tin, as it were. But I'm going to concentrate very much on the excavations we carried out this summer for 6 weeks in June and July, as the results are very dramatic and fascinating, and we're still working on the data we gained from them. And just this quick slide here just shows the various funders and organisations involved in that excavation. And if it will move on, there we are. Okay, so those who don't know where it is, St. Patrick's Chapel is at Whitesands Bay, St. David's, on the very far west of Pembrokeshire, right on the beach edge. And this next slide, I think, just demonstrates that position there. And what's important to note here is the fact that it's not only is on the beach edge, but also it is wind-blown sand. And so it's very vulnerable to erosion. It has been eroding for many decades, but the erosion has speeded up in the past few years, and it is extremely vulnerable. You can imagine wind-blown sand is very soft, and so once exposed, it will go very quickly. And essentially, the site is one of where wind-blown sand has been forming for a few thousand years, but really, as far as we're interested, about the year in the 8th century, that things started to happen. But then wind-blown sand continued to accumulate once the first part of St. Patrick's Chapel, as we know it, began to be formed. And we had about 2 meters deep of sand, which contained archaeology. So various things within that sand built up over several hundred years of use of the site. So to go straight into it, essentially, for this year's results, and the earliest structure or feature of the site we have dates to the 8th century, probably the early 8th century, and up to that point, the wind-blown sand showed no evidence of actually human activity whatsoever. But suddenly, this appears to be built. It's an oval stone-built enclosure, which had most of it exposed. It was never more than what you see here, so it's quite a low wall, in the centre of which was a rectangular structure, which I'll say quite a bit more about in a second or two. And in this slide, you see various sort of holes dug there, which are later graves, which I can say a bit more about later on. But essentially, you see there an oval enclosure, a west-facing entrance facing onto the beach, which is towards the top of the photograph, and a central rectangular structure. And within that oval enclosure, which you can't see in this photograph, was a pavement of quartz pebbles laid down. And interestingly, the entrance, which is the top left photograph there, was a stile-like entrance formed by this upright slab and 3 horizontally laid steps. And the upright slab, is, you think, probably not make on that photograph, but it's very much worn and polished by a passage of people climbing over that to get into the oval enclosure. So it was quite in the past, the 8th century. So it's quite a well-used little place to visit. And the bottom photograph just shows that there's the surviving bit of that quartz pebble pavement inside the enclosure. And immediately outside that enclosure, I apologise for the rather poor plan here. We're still working on the results of this excavation. So this is just a rough working plan. But outside the oval enclosure, outlined in red there, were 2 areas of very dark charcoal-rich soil, which contained evidence of bronze working in the form of small crucibles where they were actually melting the bronze, about the size of egg cups, and lots of little clay mold fragments where they're making various objects. Unfortunately, those mold fragments were not particularly well preserved or complete, so you couldn't actually tell what they were making. But what does survive demonstrates actually there's no known similar artifacts to what they were making there. And Mark Redknapp at the National Museum has had a look at these and will be reporting on the finds. He suggested perhaps they were making fittings, bronze fittings, for perhaps to put onto a wooden cross. But as well as the bronze fragments, we had lots and lots of bits of tiny fragments of amber, So they're working amber, perhaps making into beads. We had a couple of beads as well, amber beads. We also had some glass beads. There's also a bit of perhaps ironworking taking place. And also, interestingly, a lot of animal bone, which they were consuming on the site, which I'll say a bit about at the end, and also evidence of other foods in the form of cereal grains, charred cereal grains, wheat, barley, oats. But this activity seems to be extremely short-lived. Very quickly, it was covered by wind-blown sand, and it may have only been actually this bronze work and other activity on the site for a couple of weeks of one particular year, and then quickly went out of use. It may have even been less than that. And at this stage of the site, there's no evidence of any burials taking place whatsoever. And that's just a slide just showing that this is the 2016, that black soil deposit you see there is where the bronze working and other artifacts were found. And this rectangular structure, it's difficult to pin it down to a function. When we first came across it, we started to call it a grave, but quite clearly on excavation it wasn't a grave. There's nobody buried there. We thought perhaps it was a shrine, but again, there's one that implies that something is perhaps buried there, some relic, of which there was no evidence of that either. Perhaps it's a memorial, a cenotaph, or has been suggested a praying station. What it does resemble is a lecht, which are found on the west coast of Ireland of a similar date, 8th, 9th century, early medieval period, that you get them on several places in the west coast of Ireland. Again, the function there is not been sort of pinned down, apart from the fact they are quite clearly religious sites for some sort of religious ceremonies taking place. We took the whole thing apart, and the earliest feature is the left-hand photograph there. Essentially, it's made of upright shale slabs, and the earliest within that, a small shallow pit had been dug, which we sieved all our soil from, sent some for other site analysis in the laboratory, but nothing was found in it whatsoever. But once that was then filled in, layers of stone and sand were placed into this rectangular structure, and then, excuse me, on the center right photograph, shale slabs placed over that. Then finally, a little bit later on, quartz pebbles were placed over those shale slabs. And it's possibly here, you're looking at individuals, perhaps pilgrims or visitors to the site, each bringing a quartz pebble to place on that structure. And these slabs which make up this are really quite fascinating. This one here has got this very fine interlaced cross, very lightly scratched upon the surface of it. And most of these decorated stones, which I'll show in a second, seem to be not made by professionals as such. They're not professional stone carvers. Seem to be made by unskilled workers. This is a very fine one. There's a very simple one on that stone there, just very lightly scratched. The center one there is very unusual. And you see here a figure with his hands raised in a form of prayer, ornan, which is an early Christian position to pray in, a checkerboard pattern, other patterns, and a possible inscription, which we cannot at the moment decipher, but may be possible to do in the future once a specialist has looked at it. This is the only real, what we might call professionally made stone on the site. It's a chisel carved stone. It seems though it's originally an upright grave marker which had been reused in this structure, and the cross had actually been facing inside, so it wouldn't have been visible. So why you would do that and not expose the cross, I'm not quite sure. Another extremely lightly scratched cross on one of the stone. And most interestingly is this stone here, which is the end upright slab facing the entrance to the enclosure, which has got an inscription, a boat, and also perhaps a wave. But the inscription is most fascinating here, and this was been looked at by Patrick Sims Williams, who's a specialist in linguistics of the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. And it's an Irish name, which is Don, the first element of that word, which is usually D-O-double-N. And the second element, the OEC element, is archaic by the 8th century. It means little or small. So we're looking at small Don, essentially, is what this personal name means, which is, again, given that this could well have parallels this structure with the Lex of Western Ireland, is quite a fascinating separate piece of evidence for that connection between Wales and Ireland. What happened is that sand, they quickly covered both that over enclosure and the central rectangular feature, and it started to disappear from the landscape, at which point a very substantial cemetery wall was constructed, a rectangular cemetery wall, again with a west-facing entrance, and the first burials began to appear on the site. And I'm still working out just the sequence of burials, but it would appear that the earliest burials were of infants, and we have about, at this particular period, about 30 or so infants or even neonates and fetuses being interred on the site. And there seemed to be, at this stage, that that position of that rectangular structure was still known about. In fact, they seem to put a upright marker stone at its west end, which you can see in that photograph there. And it seems to be the desire to inter these very young children as close as possible to that rectangular structure, to the extent that on the top right photograph, they actually chopped away some of the covering slate slabs and removed some of the quartz pebbles and buried 3 infants in the structure. And on the bottom left photograph, you can see there the remains of an infant placed directly on top of the slabs, necessitating the removal of some of those quartz pebbles to bury that particular infant. So for some reason, which we're not entirely sure of at the moment, this seems to be a special place to bring young children to be buried, which is, again, unique in archaeology across Western Britain. As time moved on, sand built up again, and that rectangular structure completely disappears from the landscape, and we start to get both adults and children being buried on the site. And from that point, most of the burials are what you might call traditional Christian burials, in the sense that they are east-west aligned with a head to the west. But there are quite a few unusual ones as well. So one on the left-hand side there is face down and also flexed. And we had about 4 or 5 face down burials, all about the same level. Again, there's various theories of why you would bury someone face down. It has been suggested that actually people perhaps of dubious morals, but perhaps more likely they actually are to show particularly religious people are being buried face down because of that reason. The one in the centre is a double adult burial, again, both face down. The heads are missing because they were removed by later graves in antiquity. And the one on the right is what we're thinking is that we're calling a bag burial. And it may well be this particular individual has been brought to the site from some distance away to be buried here and being transported in a bag. and Katie Hamer, Sheffield University, is looking at all the human remains, will be analysing this particular burial to see if they've got particular bacteria on those bones to indicate actually that there was some decay taking place well before burial. It's not until the 9th century when we get the first what we call kist graves, or long kist graves, which I'll show a couple more photographs in a second of those, which are these stone-lined graves with stone covering slabs. And this is a particularly good example of one, which has an upright marker stone, cross marker stone at its west end. And the only reason that survives upright is simply because it was very quickly covered in windblown sand, and the top edge of it is quite badly damaged. You can almost imagine just the top of that stone poking through sand and being kicked around and damaged at some time in the 9th, 10th century. And you just get an idea there that they good preservation of the bones at this site. This is just a couple of long kist graves as they're first exposed with the covering slabs on them. I've really just put that in here just to show just how, first of all, how close to the beach we are, but also just how vulnerable the site is to erosion. And these 2 kist graves being excavated here were at the west ends, the head ends of those graves were removed by storms in the winter of 2014. So you can see just how quickly the site is starting to disappear to erosion. What happened is that burials continue to be buried, more sand, more burials, more sand, more burials, and so forth, to about 12 deep stacked up in burials. And eventually, over that area of both the oval enclosure and rectangular cemetery enclosure, a layer of stone rubble is laid down, and what we know is stone-built St. Patrick's Chapel is constructed on top of that. And we still do get some burials associated with that chapel, but at this stage they go back to being just children again, with no adults present. Not many at this stage, but the graves are all rather unusual. So you see one here on the left-hand side, which is a child's grave with these quartz pebbles placed over it, clearly meant to be seen on the surface. The earlier kist graves I showed you, long kist graves, were buried, would not have been visible, but this and about 4 or 5 others would have been. And as well as having quartz placed over them, we had a couple of graves where limpet shells have been placed over the top of the graves rather than quartz. And that drawing there you see of a pin, a ring-headed pin, bronze pin, is one of the few artifacts from this later stages of the site. And that's a Viking age pin made in Dublin in the mid to late 11th century. And that's been pushed into the ground, vertically into the ground, immediately outside the entrance of the chapel. And what happens then is that the burial rite with that chapel seems to cease, perhaps in the 11th, early 12th century. But the chapel continues in use, and continues in use until the 16th century, when finally it's just abandoned and just left to decay. Oh, and that's it. That's the west end of the chapel as exposed and excavated. It wasn't a well-constructed building, to say the least. It was continually having to be repaired. Bits of wall seemed to be falling off it and being replaced. Some of the facades of it were completely fell off and built up. So although it's quite a simple building, originally a west-facing entrance, which was then blocked up and the entrance referred to the south wall. The reason being, we think, is that the west-facing entrance was just being too exposed and sand was just blowing into the building. Hence, the position of the entrance was changed at some stage. And just that these burials I mentioned that go with the chapel, this 11th century chapel, we're still getting some quite simple grave markers. This particular stone here, you see, it had a cross both on the top side and underside. Simple cross scratched onto the surfaces, almost certainly by the parents or relations of the child that was buried here, just to denote the Christian faith of those people. I mentioned that Katie Hamer of Sheffield is looking at the human remains. This is still very much work in progress, but you see there the total excavated of burials, we had about 270, and that's to give you an idea just how the density of the site. That's an area about 10 meters by 8 meters, and so far you see there again from the what Katie calls non-adults. That's generally individuals under the age of 18. Very high number of those, particularly infants and young children, reflecting probably both infant mortality rates, but also something else is happening here. There's just such an extremely high number there that we suspect that this was a special place to bring children to be buried. And again, of the adults, there's quite a high percentage of females as opposed to males, which again, when you look at those in detail, which Katie started to do, there seems to be quite a lot of females, young adults, essentially females, which may reflect death in childbirth. And unusually, as the previous slide showed, there's a very high percentage of children, young children on the site. Partly, we think, due to the good preservation of the bones, but also there's something culturally taking place here as well. The preservation was remarkable, that even you see the bottom left-hand photograph, it's possible to recover the ear ossicles, the tiny bones of the ears. And really this was due to the sterling work put in by Trish and Helen, two of the volunteers who sieved and cleaned and catalogued all the bone from the site. And these are being looked at, the ear ossicles for DNA. So Katie is doing various bits of analyses on these bones, looking at, well, it's actually the Crick Institute from London are looking at the DNA of a very large number of individuals. And we're hoping to be able to get, first of all, you can tell the sex of children from DNA, which you can't do just by examining the skeletons, but also possibly getting some family relationships going on, and also seeing if there's a change of population over time on the site. But also we're going to look at isotopic analysis, which Sian mentioned in her talk, to try and see if we can determine where people were, if they were born in not local, essentially, and whether people are being brought to site either to be buried specially, or is quite a population movement as well taking place. But this is still very much work in progress. And I mentioned the animal bone that was found in the early parts of the site, the lower levels. It's quite a large collection of bone. Not surprisingly, the sheep and cattle are the most common, but other ones you wouldn't perhaps expect to find. Otter are there, and other small mammals, which do seem to be being eaten, and not just a casual sort of finds at the site. And some of the bird bones are very interesting as well, which we've got a whole variety there, as you say, which some were quite clearly being eaten. They are burnt bones with some butchery marks on them, particularly guillemots were being eaten, which again is perhaps nothing we would do nowadays. And can I just thank all the volunteers who took part over the several years of excavation. It's probably run into the hundreds now, and really we're out there extremely hard, diligent work. This would not have taken place. And also just a final thing about it was an extremely popular site amongst visitors, and both through social media more distant and also people visiting in person. And this year, in the 6 weeks we did this year, we had someone dedicated just to showing people around, giving tours and so forth. In fact, we had more than one person at times. And we showed just this year about 17,000 people around the site. So it was immensely popular for a whole variety of reasons. And say we are still working on the results, which will take some time to actually achieve those. And I think my time's probably up, so I'll probably stop there if I may. Thank you very much.